Dr. Karen Mundy. She's an associate professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, and she's also the Canada Research Chair at the University of Toronto. She was named by Time magazine as 6 of the top education thought leaders in Canada. Her research work is very interesting but too long to list, so I hope that she will talk about it herself. I think of her as my academic grandparent because I was a student of hers. And her current interest areas are in private-public partnership and civil society participation in education, which I believe will be a part of what you're going to cover in your talk today. So, over to Karen.
Thank you. I'm off overnight.
Just like
No, I'm not offended at all. Actually, I think there's a lot of wisdom in grandparents. So I'm going to start today just by telling you a little bit about myself. I'm very, very pleased to be here. It's my first time in India. I don't know if this is working. Huh? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I usually can project quite loudly. I don't need a microphone. It's my first time in India, and I had no idea when I suggested this title for the talk that I was going to have an opportunity to actually witness civil society in action on many levels while here. And of course, yesterday, as you know, the Hazar protests, about 6 or 7 kilometers of it I got to witness. So it's been really very exciting just to be here at this time, and a bit humbling too. So I just want to begin by saying I really don't know very much about Indian civil society, and I feel that I'm really approaching this with a beginner's mind. I'm going to give you some of the research I've done mainly in Africa, and I hope at the end of the talk you'll ask me some questions or share some insights that you have about civil society or education civil society in the Indian context. So just some background, areas of research interest. I started my life as a teacher teaching in rural Zimbabwe in southern Africa. So I know the education field very, very well from the point of view of an educator. And after that, I returned to work for a civil society organization in Canada that worked on South Africa education. So I also know the education field from a northern NGO perspective. And finally, I decided to go back to school and do my PhD. So I know the field of civil society and education from the point of view of a researcher. I wear a lot of different hats in my life, and one of them is as an activist. So in Canada and around the world, there are national coalitions set up among civil society actors to promote the right to education. And I sit on and co-chair the Canadian coalition in this area. So I sit on a team with a member of about 35 Canadian civil society actors who try to support in various ways the realization of the right to education internationally. My research interests have been quite varied. I have been a long-time analyst and critic of the international organizations that operate in the education policy space. And right now we're working on a series of research articles on the World Bank. So if you have questions about these large, mega global actors, I know something about them. I've been really very interested in the construction of education for all as a global policy space, and more recently in the emergence of different kinds of public-private partnerships. I'm interested in the theory of change that these organizations embody as they try to work towards the realization of education for all. Of course, as I mentioned, I began as a teacher in Southern Africa, and I continue to do field work on educational change on that continent. And I'm a very strong devotee of the field of comparative education, and I believe thoroughly that people can learn a great deal by looking at issues in education, not only in their own countries, but in other countries as well. So the research I've done on civil society, just to set the stage, has really been primarily mapping work, trying to understand both global scale actors and then looking at the national level to see who is education civil society. And I've also completed a study of the transnational civil society network, the Global Campaign for Education. Over the last, I would say, 3 or 4 years, I became increasingly interested in India. And the reason for this is that I observed in trips to Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya that actions and methods used by Indian civil society are being transferred very rapidly to this part of the world. And in particular, the work of Pratham and the ACER methodology has now transferred to a program called OISE and OISE in East Africa. Of course, nobody working on EFA could have ignored the fact that India passed a Right to Education Act and that there's been substantive civil society activism in this area. So I think it's actually a very wonderful time to start to develop an interest in civil society and to try to observe what's happening on the Indian Sea. So the outline of my talk today, I want to start by just asking us to all think a little bit about what civil society is, how we would define it. I'm going to give you a couple of key questions that I have used to frame my own research. I want to talk about the way officials frame civil society in national education plans and in international organizations. And I want to compare that to the way that these transnational civil society actors, like the Global Campaign for Education and the major international non-governmental organizations, frame civil society's role a little differently. Then I want to look at some of the mapping research we did in 5 African countries, so that you can get a sense, at least in those contexts, what is education, civil society, and what's it doing, and how has it changed over the last decade. I want to look then at the idea of social citizenship and why neither the transnational civil society map of what civil society should do, nor the official policy discourse on civil society really gets us to where I think we need to be when we want to discuss civil society and education, especially education for all. And then I'll ask a few questions about India's civil society. So first, the definitional challenges. And there's a lot of definitional challenges in this area. The first, perhaps, and most important challenge is that civil society itself is a construct that comes from Western political theory. So we have to always keep in mind that when we discuss civil society, our gaze tends to go to organizational forms that look very Western. And that's, I think, a handicap. It certainly is one that I've found in my research. What is civil society in political theory? It's often framed as a space. Not a set of organizations, but a space that operates between the family, between the state, and between the market, independent of those main constructs in our societies. Another definition often used is the one that you're more familiar with, which is formal voluntary organizations of all kinds. If I asked you who's education, civil society, you'd probably start to generate a list something like this one. Maybe in India you'd add a few kinds of actors that I don't have here. But it would include non-governmental organizations, community-based organizations, all kinds of citizen groups, international groups, private sector associations, faith-based organizations, teachers' unions, parents' associations, and perhaps even other social movement organizations that operate not only on education but other social and equity issues. It's a really big group, and each of the organizations in it has a different theory of change, sometimes competing, sometimes not well coordinated. The other way of looking at civil society is to ask, well, what's the main job of this thing called civil society? And here we have a lot of debate in the theoretical literature. Perhaps the most powerful framing of civil society in the international development literature, in studies of development, is that civil society itself is the thing that's going to build the autonomous capacity of societies for self-help. So it's really the sense that these are grassroots self-help organizations. In Western political theory, civil society is often framed as that thing that helps create trust and belonging in the society. So it's not the formal organizations, it's actually the processes of interaction that produce a sense of common identity and trust. Some people think of civil society as enhancing representation in politics. And you'll know around the ANA demonstrations that this is a big, big debate between people like Arundhati Roy, who think that the protest, the Gandhian protest that's being held isn't actually representative and isn't democratic, and those who think that it is. But some people think of civil society's role as actually being a representational one, and others think of civil society's main job as being contentious. not working with government, but working against government to hold up a mirror and provide criticism and opposition. In my work, I try to keep all of these different theoretical frames for thinking of civil society in mind. And in some of my earlier work, I've tried to ask the question, is this civil society doing, is this civil society actually doing these main roles? Which of them is it emphasizing and which not? But the two cross-cutting questions that have lain behind the research I've done in Africa are really, first, what role are these civil society actors playing in the governance of education for all? So I'm asking a governance question, not a question about service provision, but about governance. How are they shaping decisions about equity in basic education? And then how can civil society actors influence official efforts to shape these equitable educational opportunities and life chances? Well, the global policy-scape, I don't know if you've ever heard that term, policy-scape, but it means policy landscape. So what is it that in the international community of education experts, what are we talking about in terms of civil society? And I think it's important not to underestimate the extent to which this global policy landscape now shapes everything we think and talk about in relation to civil society. If you think of just these recent demonstrations in India, and you look and you'll see how they're being framed in the New York Times, in the Guardian. They instantly, any civil society action is picked up and translated into a language in this global policy landscape. For education civil society has of course been shaped by globalization. In one way, civil society has prospered and grown dramatically because of globalization. In two ways. First, as the state shrunk at a time of enhanced liberalization, as social service capacity of the government shrunk, opportunities for civil society to grow were enormous. So in almost every country, you'll see that the number of registered civil society actors has blossomed over the last 20 years. It's paradox. The lowered capacity of the state produces an enhanced capacity of civil society. Flip it around. Democratic transitions produces a space for that civil society. So positive and negative context produces this large growth. For education, in the very official policy frames, if you look at the national education sector plans of countries in Africa, developing countries almost anywhere, you'll see a set of policy prescriptions that define a role for civil society very much at the local level. And this is part of this global policy scape. You probably have experienced or realized that these are parts of the policy scape in India. First, decentralize. So remove the central control of the system and push governance down to a local level. Second, introduce local level accountability structures. So make sure that you have school management committees or parent-teacher associations that actually hold the service deliverer to account. Introduce some kind of choice mechanism or some kind of competition to improve the quality of education. And then begin to provide information to the client so that the client can make choices or hold the service provider to account. So this policy scape was captured very nicely in this diagram, which comes from the 2004 World Bank annual report, Making Services Work for the Poor. And if you look at this diagram and you read the document, you'll see that the main, I have to carry this around with me. The main intention, the main emphasis is down here in this part of the diagram. At the top, you have the state and the policymakers. They're considered the people we should just avoid. On the side, we have the providers, the ones who are actually doing the work of educating children, organizations on the front line, and the management. And on this side, we have not just citizens, but clients, who are both the poor and the non-poor. And their job is to now work in a short route form of accountability. That is, they're going to hold the provider of your service to account. They're going to make sure that this provider serves them. Long-run accountability is up here. This is the accountability that occurs on a national scale, and sometimes even on a supranational scale. Here's where clients have the ability to shape redistribution at the national scale, to make their governments provide the rights of social citizenship. But in the official policy scape, this arena is not very much discussed or debated, except when we come to discussions about good governance. But by and large, for education, the main action in the official policy scape is here. So the focus is on the local or community role of civil society, the link between the local level and the national level of civil society is very rarely discussed. If you look at policy documents, and I can tell you what we did was looked at poverty reduction strategy papers that are the sort of compact between donors and developing countries across about 20 countries. And in each case, you'll find the same pattern. Civil society includes just about everyone except teachers' unions, because they block this local level of accountability. And then very, very little interest in what are the mobilizing frames, what are the theories of action that each civil society actor has. Are there differences between for-profit civil society actors and non-profit? Are there differences between the theory of change that constituency-based, so membership-based organizations, versus donor organizations who really have no constituency at all? We claim, when we work for INGOs, we claim we acted on behalf of the poor, but we hardly ever really ask their opinion, and they certainly don't elect us. Teachers' organizations, as I said already, neglected. In official rhetoric, the first is from the World Declaration on Education for All in 1990. Partnerships at the community level should be encouraged. They can harmonize activities, utilize resources more effectively, and mobilize additional finance and human resources where necessary. So the intention is put the responsibility at the local level. DFID says, a greater participation of parents and communities in education of their children plays a central role in stimulating education at a local level, in building pressure for improving quality, and in developing accountability. So I don't mean to say that there's anything wrong with local level accountability or participation at these levels, but just to point out that again and again in the policy documents, the idea that at the national level there is a civil society form of activism required is left out of the picture. The view from transnational civil society organizations like the Global Campaign for Education and the major rights-based, that's okay, there's lots of chairs in here if you wanted to slide across. And power over the last 2 decades. At the Dakar World Forum on Education for All, we could really see a turning point for the first time when world leaders and major international organizations came together. A whole bunch of different kinds of civil society actors came together and in a way offered an alternative set of policy precepts to the world community about education for all. And they were able, in fact, to demand a much larger role in decision making, at least in the international community and in international efforts. At that time, in 2000, the Global Campaign for Education was born, led initially by Oxfam and Action Aid and Education International, the International Teachers Unions group. And these organizations had become very good at using a repertoire, an advocacy repertoire, to gain a seat, a voice at the table in other UN bodies. And now they began to use it in education. But we also can't underestimate the extent to which national level civil society actors were there at Dakar. And at that time, in about 2000, I think there were about 25 countries that had coalitions of civil society actors participating. Today, there are about 88 countries that have coalitions of civil society actors. And some of them are very, very active and quite contentious in the form of activity they choose to take on. Most exciting examples, I think, Campe from Bangladesh and the Right to Education Network in Brazil, CLADE in Latin America. These organizations, their theory of action is actually very much focused on national level politics and often involves the use of justice or the judiciary, that is, legal claims about rights. Just to get a sense from these organizations the way they look at civil society, not as a local accountability system, but rather as something much more powerful at the national level. Here's the first. This actually is from the civil society part of the declaration of 2000, the Dakar Declaration. A central part of the plan should be the agreement by 2001 of clear and binding mechanisms for the ongoing democratic participation of civil society, including teachers, parents, and learners, across all levels of the education system. Governments must commit themselves to develop and improve mechanisms and structures of democratic participation of and accountability to civil society, including teachers and their representative organizations in education decisions at all levels. The second is actually from Oxfam and ActionAid publication. I think it gets at the kind of contestation or controversy that these organizations wish to stir up. In order to get to education to the top of the political agenda, we need to create controversy. We need to provoke people, generate anger and outrage. We should develop a common identity for our education work at all levels, which captures our positioning with poor people rather than for them and generates passionate engagement. The artificial consensus on education needs to be challenged. So these are groups that at the international level really want to stir the pot and want to draw attention to the national level role for civil society. So to summarize, in these groups the emphasis is on education as a right, not education as a service, education as a state responsibility. There's a lot of discussion, but a clear agreement among them that civil society actors shouldn't provide services. The state should provide the service, and civil society should act to promote or to support the state, maybe, but mainly to advocate for the state's provision of services. There's a lot more attention in this new policy discourse from transnational civil society to the problems of civil society not coordinating itself. And I'm sure you know this if you go into any small town in India, any small town in almost any country in the world, you'll find many, many, many charitable organizations and civil society actors not working together, not interfacing or making demands in a collective way. So one of the hallmarks of this new trend has been, let's get together and make a common agenda vis-a-vis the state. The focus here on rights and claims making. So citizens should be allowed to make claims, not just at the local level, but they should be aggregating voice at the national level. And then finally, something quite new, recognition that civil society might be able to get some resources, at least ideological resources, by using the transnational scale as a forum for action. I want to give you an example of this later in the talk in relation to civil society and education for all. But for now, I just want to say that in research on this kind of civil society activism, the term boomerang is usually used. So the civil society actor at the national level can get leverage with its government, but sometimes by appealing to a broader transnational civil society can force its government to pay greater attention to an issue area. And that would be a boomerang approach. So just to really quickly, just to summarize, you've got an official view. It's focused on client and service provider relations. The main role of civil society in this model is accountability at the local level. A lot of research and a lot of experiments will be focused on voice at the local level. There's a very instrumental view of civil society. And the definition of civil society actually ignores the largest single constituency-based civil society actor in education, the teachers' union. The civil society view, its main role is to ensure that education as a right is delivered by the nation state and supported by the international community. Insists that civil society organizations should not provide parallel services. Instead, they should advocate government for improving the services. Thinks that civil society can actually benefit from leveraging transnational activism, and recognizes that there's going to be a big problem in linking local citizen voice to this national advocacy. So around 2006, 2007, we got some funding from the International Development Research Council to look at 4 countries and to map education, civil society in these countries. The first 4 were Tanzania, Kenya, Burkina Faso, and Mali. And then later, the Hewlett Foundation funded me to do a second study, well, 5th country study, but a second era study in Uganda. And these were very simple studies in concept. We just really went into these countries and we started to ask people, well, what is education, civil society? We looked at government documents, we looked at meeting minutes, and we said, who's there? And we went and interviewed all of the organizations, and we looked and asked them what their theory of change is. What were they doing to ensure the achievement of EFA? We also decided to go and look in a few selected communities at local level civil society, starting at a school and asking, how do parents voice their interests and concerns? How do NGOs in this community interface with the school, and so on? And that's just a descriptive table of the numbers of NGOs and civil society actors we met with, and then the number of government leaders and donors we met with. So some really high-level findings, because I'm not going to tell you about the individual countries. Each had quite a different policy landscape. Some are much heavier in their dependency on foreign aid. Kenya, for example, is not so dependent, but Burkina Faso, Mali, and Tanzania, Uganda are all highly dependent on foreign aid. So national level civil society, it's a very common picture. In every single one of these countries, civil society, the number has grown tenfold, at least tenfold, sometimes more than tenfold overall. And in education, the numbers are very, very substantial. There's often not a really good list anywhere, but estimates ranged in some countries up to 500 civil society organizations. These are small countries compared to India, so keep that in mind. They're even small compared to a single Indian state. So to have 500 education NGOs is actually quite a substantial and impressive number. In the national decision making, indeed, there are more invited spaces. The government feels it has to consult with these organizations. But when you look at who's there at the policy table, quickly you realize that it's the international non-governmental actors who are there. Domestic civil society actors are actually rather rarely at the policy table. And part of the reason for this is that there's a huge fear of reprisal, significant fear that if we criticize government, we'll never be employed by government, or perhaps they'll close down our offices, and so on. So sometimes the strategy, in fact, is to let the INGOs represent our ideas so that we don't face reprisals when we're critical. Other times it simply is that the INGOs are in effect the funders of the NGOs. The NGOs wouldn't exist if the INGOs weren't there. So there's a degree of dependency that drives voice at the national level. When you look at what these civil society actors do, when they come to the policy table, what do they talk about and what are they doing? In African countries, they're talking, but they're not using evidence, or very rarely. This is quite unlike the Pratim and the ACER experiment here in India, where a civil society group goes out and does a large-scale survey and comes to the government and says, look how badly you're doing. Our children aren't learning. In Africa, that's a very rare experience until quite recently. So mostly people are coming with a philosophical point of view. We need more child-centered learning. We have to take care of the poor, but without evidence. There's almost no constituency-based organizations. So most of the organizations are charitable organizations, but they're not parents' councils or affiliations of parents. They're not teachers' unions. They're not, there's not faith-based organizations. And again, when you look at what they're doing, they're not going to the judiciary. They're not using parliamentary structures. Mainly, civil society is talking to education bureaucrats. They're not talking to official democracy. They're talking to the administrative apparatus of the education state. And when you also look at what they're doing, you see that they have very, very few alliances outside their sector. So they're not linking up with other social movements, environmental movements, anti-debt movements. They're quite separate. They're very focused on the technical reform of education systems. And also they're not building alliances with corporate actors. There's no Azim Premji Foundation. So they're very much in their own technical bubble. But then we looked at the community school interface to ask, well, what's happening with civil society there? And in this area, I must say that our data is much less robust, so it's actually quite anecdotal. We only could go to 3 communities in each country. But it gave us a feel for what might be going on. What we saw here is that most community-based NGOs were funded by INGOs, very uncoordinated. And they could be doing very similar programs and not know about it. They weren't learning from one another's innovation, and they were rarely scaling those innovations up to the national level. Their main role, quite contrary to the global policy scape suggested by transnational civil society, is to fill a gap. They're actually providing services. They have, if you ask them, if you look at what they're doing, they'll tell you that they have a very, very limited ability to build up a constituency on behalf of education. There are in all of these countries enormous decentralization reforms happening and school-based management reforms. But when you look at what the kind of voice, the kind of space for civil society being created, you find that it's pretty scripted. Sure, you've got a school management committee now, but the school management committee, and it has a little bit of money to spend, but it's told that it has to buy 1 eraser per child, 1 book, 10 pencils, and this reader. It doesn't have any practice in democracy through this new local level accountability space. And in fact, there's lots of good research now coming out to show that these parent councils are not really very representative of the poor at all. So the poor don't actually learn to have voice through these local accountability mechanisms. Instead, these mechanisms are really to prevent corruption and smoother administration of a budget, not to produce democratic citizenship at the local level. It's true that in almost every single country we went to, 4 out of the 5, if I went into a school, I would see outside the school a budget. It would tell me that on September 1st, so much money was received by the school. It bought this many books, this many pencils, and this many notebooks. And every parent, if I asked the headmaster what would happen, because a circular in the newspaper would appear that the money had gone to the school, and I asked the headmisters and masters, what would happen if you didn't post it the day after it was in the newspaper? And they'd say, oh, within a week, many parents would come to complain that they hadn't seen these resources that were supposed to be transferred to the school. So indeed, some level of informational accountability was working very well. But again, as I said, it wasn't the kind of democratic space for voice that one might have expected. The other thing, and I was really struck, we went out to Mundy this week to see a few schools. And I think this must be a considerable challenge here in India as well as in many African countries. But it's really obvious in the community level, especially in a peri-urban, closer to town area, that in fact the reason it's hard to get a constituency for education is that the middle classes don't send their children to the same schools as the poor. So very difficult. These organizations are now filling in gaps, providing services, but they haven't figured out how to activate a common constituency to advocate for more equality or a common school. Just a note about the interface between this national civil society and the global level. Well, we found that it was mainly a top-down performance. So the global campaign would say, everybody, it's April, it's Global Action Week, make sure to do a few demonstrations, make sure to visit a few parliamentarians, and in each country a bunch of groups would come together, they do this, they hope to get a piece in the national paper. But what they weren't doing is saying, as part of this in our country, we're dependent on foreign donors, and we're going to monitor what they're doing in our country. No, nothing like that was happening. So really a one-way street, the international, transnational groups saying, have a celebration, celebrate EFA, get it on the policy agenda, and the local groups basically doing whatever activity was suggested by the global level. Some variations I mentioned already, Tanzania, a very interesting case of the boomerang that I mentioned before. In Tanzania, in 1999, fees were charged in most primary school, public primary schools. A small group of education researchers working in a very active NGO were able to show actually how much the parents were paying for school. And they passed on this information to an anti-debt movement in the US. That group managed to circulate that data across a large number of US organizations and conducted a lobbying campaign in the US Congress and Senate, which resulted in the US government banning the World Bank from including fees in any of its lending operations in the world. And within a year, school fees were removed in Tanzania. So you can see that boomerang. The National Civil Society says something's really wrong here, passes good information up to the transnational level. Those groups manage to advocate a policy change in an international organization. The international organization changes its policy, and a government itself then removes fees. So that was a very powerful, but it's a one-off example. I mentioned OISE, which is an effort to do a very Pratham ACER-like experiment in East Africa, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. And I also want to mention one other, we thought it was a fantastic and very unusual experiment, which is the Uganda Teachers Union, which has completely reformulated what it does to develop on its own, without any pressure from outside actors, to develop an approach to training its members around an ethical code of conduct for teachers. So a very unusual step taken by teachers' unions, which we know normally argue for wage, but in this case actually tried to set up an ethical standard for the behavior of teachers and circulated it very widely, trained almost all their members, and actually advocated government to put in place true sanctions for teachers who broke these ethical norms. What were those norms? They were not using corporal punishment, not having sexual relations with students, and showing up at school. So in summary, if you looked at these 5 African cases, what you'd see is that local level accountability systems in place, but not really producing a lot of citizen voice and not linked up to the national level. Transnational leverage almost never utilized, and usually it's a one-way street from the top down. And then the organization of education civil society in the national policy space. So their voice in discussions about the right to education is much louder now, but still it's actually relatively weak. Some people describe it as being invited to the table. And this was really a tangible description from Tanzania. One actor told us, you know, we get invited, but then at the last minute they change the place. So we're invited, but we arrive and it's not there. So basically, invited to the table and then move the table somewhere else. It's a very typical experience in these countries. I just want to say something then about some other research, not my own research, but other research and experimentation with civil society action. First of all, I hope some of you in your classes will, or in your research will come across a new publication by the World Bank called Making Schools Work. Look, it's online. You can download it. It's a very interesting document. And read it very carefully, because the document is not about a series of interventions that will make schools work. But it's a document that shows that the many multitude of experiments in local level accountability have produced results that are absolutely not as encouraging as the original model would have suggested. So read it carefully, because as a very typical thing in the World Bank, they exaggerate, they come up and say it's about making schools work, and they say that the interventions are promising, but when they actually present a synthesis of all the research on things like school level report cards, parent level councils, school-based management, the results are actually pretty weak. So when they may work, but we still don't have any robust evidence that they work in most situations. On school-based management, the most interesting thing is that we have a sense that something works, but we don't know which of the many things works. Does it work if you give the headmaster control over hiring, or the community? Does it work if you have school report cards? We just don't know. We can't compare these interventions and say which one is better. Sometimes they actually produce the opposite intention. They actually disempower the poor. So very uneven results from this local accountability experiment. I personally have a great deal of sympathy for this development of local voice, but I suspect that if we think about it in terms of serving a client and not in terms of developing opportunities for democratic citizenship, we're going to be barking up the wrong tree. At the transnational level, there's been a good deal of research now about other kinds of transnational mobilizing. And in the health sector, it's been enormously successful, particularly in generating new resources for health. Education hasn't been at all successful in generating new resources. Compared to health, we're extremely weak and almost laughably so. I don't know the real reason for this, except to say that mirrored at the transnational level is the same problem as we face at the local level, and that is that we have not found how to build a common identity or a common set of demands for a unified and equitable form of schooling. And around the world, if you look around the world, with perhaps some exceptions, Brazil, maybe Canada, some countries in Europe, we've got a situation for EFA that can be described as improvements in access, but the vanishing of the common school. So we are not looking at, we are looking at formally every child stepping into a classroom, but in practical terms. This is not education for all. This is educations, different educations for different people. And that trend is occurring all around the world. I think when we start asking that question, well, are we seeing a massive bifurcation? We've been focused on getting those last few children, or not last few, the last many hundreds of millions of children into school. And we've missed perhaps an opportunity to ask the question, once we get all those kids into the first grade classroom, are they going to be more equitable in a global society? I wonder. And that brings me to this slide. I wanted to just talk a little bit about thinking about social citizenship. If we think about social citizenship, it brings our eyes up to the national and sometimes even the global level. It's a term that was coined by T.H. Marshall, and he used it to describe a common moment, perhaps within about a 20-year period, when Western governments shifted from a focus on political and civil rights to providing a certain set of social rights, a certain set of entitlements as part of citizenship, a kind of set of guarantees. And then other scholars, working with the notion of social citizenship, began to try to explore how in the world is it that governments and powerful elites in society actually agreed to entitlements, which in fact, of course, had to be paid for from resources that were captured by the rich. How did that happen? In this comparative research on social citizenship, we know a few things. We don't know everything, but we know some things. We know for sure that where social citizenship expanded, there was organized civil society at the national level. It wasn't local level accountability alone that could do it, but national level organizing. And we know that rights were not achieved by consensus, but by contest. That is, some groups had to oppose or act as opposition to the pattern of political action in the state. We also know that, and this is something that we don't often think about, but that it wasn't actually the poor's voice that produced social citizenship regimes, these new entitlements, but actually coalitions between middle class and the poor. So expanding the voice of the poor is a very noble enterprise, but making sure that a set of common interests exists between the poor and the middle class turned out to be the thing that most helped in expanding these common entitlements. And then we also know that depending on how these different alliances formed, the kinds of social citizenship entitlements that were achieved could look very, very different. We've got very expansive welfare states in the Nordic countries. You've got very, very minimal welfare states, very minimal entitlements in countries like the UK and the US. I think, from reading that social citizenship literature and thinking about civil society, I take away three things. First of all, the emphasis on local accountability, while not bad, isn't going to get us where we need to go in terms of national systems that redistribute resources and set into place a set of entitlements that are wide and commonly held. To be successful, it seems that there has to be an effort to link the interests of the poor and the non-poor. And that's a puzzle that I think every activist working in education struggles with, particularly in the context of this bifurcation of different kinds of schooling. And then I think finally, if you look at this research on social entitlements and how welfare states emerge, you come very quickly to the notion that it wasn't instrumental citizenship. That is, it wasn't the client versus the service provider. It wasn't that dynamic. It was the development of meaning frames, ways of thinking that people adopted. So it wasn't just their instrumental interests, but it was their belief systems, their values, their frame for imagining a good society that impacted and shaped and allowed the coalitions to press governments successfully forward. So just returning to India, and I would not be so bold as to begin to say anything about Indian civil society, so guess what? I just have a series of questions that I hope to explore in some future research, perhaps in collaboration with colleagues here at the university. But also I'd love to hear your responses to them. Well, the first question I have is, who's in this education civil society? Who's out there? I know there are teachers' unions. I know there's a national coalition. I know there's Pratham. And I know there's a Right to Education Act that likely wouldn't have existed without education civil society. But I don't know anything about it, and I'd love to know more. Well, I want to know whether these actors are thinking in the terms I'm thinking. Are they actually thinking about social citizenship and education in relation to that social citizenship? Or are they thinking about it in terms of voice and local level accountability? I want to know what Indian civil society actors think of as their main jobs. And remember, I showed at the beginning that there's very different concepts or constructs, very different beliefs about what civil society should do. I imagine that there are many different actors picking up different threads of these roles or functions. Some of them focusing on building autonomous associational life, some focused on creating trust and civility, some trying to create a collective agenda of common interests, some trying to enhance representation, and others thinking of themselves mainly as agents of contest. I'd really like to know more about how these local experiments, school management committees, village councils, how these actually are really affecting the voice of the average citizen in India, especially in education. And I'd also like to know whether those efforts to have space where the poor and the middle can speak are linked up to national advocacy efforts. And finally, I'd like to hear from you what you think the main challenges India's civil society faces in creating a common and equitable entitlement to education in your country. So that's all I'm going to say for now, and I really do welcome questions, reflections, comments. Questions, comments, reflections? Yeah.
If no one is speaking,
No, please.
maybe we can start. More questions will come after that. I was thinking about your questions actually, and actually when you were speaking, first of all, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. But while you were speaking and giving this description and this analysis, I was personally thinking about Indian civil society. And this particularly relates to your question number 2, roles. In India, there has been a tradition, I do not know whether that could be called civil society in technical way or not, but during the freedom struggle, there were many, at that time they were not called NGOs. This word later on came, brought by World Bank. They were called either voluntary agencies or social service agencies or social service organizations. And they started many educational institutions. I'll talk about education.
Yes, please.
And at the local level as well as colleges and higher education. That was an effort to directly intervene in the society and in the action.
Yes.
And therefore also change people's mindset. So someone was running a school.
Yes.
Is also changing people's
Yes.
mindset about the school, about teaching, about what education should be doing. And then later on we graduated into NGOs. And now we are discovering civil society. I see a movement, and the one interesting thing you said, this is very important in that sense, that a local NGO wanted to influence the government and connected with some international NGO, and therefore they could be influenced. It's a very serious issue. This might be rather troublesome in the sense that now that voluntary agency spirit is more or less dying in India. What is replacing that is NGO, which is called civil society now.
Right.
Now the new NGO is defining its job as advocacy.
Yes.
They are not supposed to provide service.
Yes.
So it's a very fair and good description. But at the same time, which means that they are not going to get into action
Yes.
at the local level.
Yes.
Therefore, they cannot effect any social transformation even at the smallest level.
Yeah.
So social transformation now should come from advocacy.
Right. It's a very different model of action.
Money for the advocacy will come from the international NGOs. And the channelizing of the advocacy will be through the government.
Yeah.
Which means they are tools of the government and the international NGO. And the advocacy which will finally filter will be decided by the international NGO and the government. And people's voices will be further curtailed in this model.
Yeah.
So this interesting model of advocacy and pressurizing the government from the above actually cuts their roots at the people's level. I think that is very visible. Second thing I would like to say is that evidence-based policy has its politics, and I do not know whether we are paying attention to that. Because evidence, supposing that the global trend is that people should have choice, and choices could be got only through allowing the market free access into the of the private partner into the market, then there could be evidence generated which says that free choice provided through the private school enhances the possibility of better education
That's
for
right.
poor.
Which is,
But
in fact, something that you see, that the form of evidence you'll see everywhere.
Most of the empirical research facts could always be interpreted in this way or that way, depending what assumptions you used. But you can produce that evidence, and that evidence could be used for opening up more space for profit making in education. So evidence-based policy recommendations might have their own politics. That politics in India at this moment is pretty strong and fierce. You used several times in a very laudatory term RTE, which is good, which is beautiful. But at the same time, I do not know whether people are paying attention. That RTE was mainly, I'm sorry, I won't take more time, just one minute.
I think that it would be better if I came to hear his lecture, and then I would learn all about Indian civil society, so let him speak, I think.
I just mentioned two things about RTE. One, RTE was formulated and people were fighting for last perhaps 15 years for this, because they wanted the government to be accountable for good quality education for every child. And our government for last 40 years has been giving non-formal education to the poorest child rather than equal education.
Right.
So RTE demand came from that. Now RTE is formulated. As soon as this became implementable and government started implementing, every NGO, every good school which was not government school is feeling that this is turned around. Now government, there is no talk of government fulfilling the promises of RTE in their schools, but they are ready to close down good schools which were being run by other people. So RTE actually in the hands of the implementation and the government has been turned around. Most of its provisions are grossly diluted, and already this is becoming a sort of useless piece. And civil society now is not able to resist that. Some people think that RTE, that is, I'm not saying I think that, but in India there are two views about RTE. There is a minority analysis that RTE was a tool to open education for all. This is a long analysis, I wouldn't go into that. So therefore, all these advocacy-based things, because its nature is such that direct involvement with the people and educating the people for democratic rights is not part of it, and it only comes through the advocacy. Therefore, it can never come actually pro-poor. This will always be filtered and distorted. I'm sorry if I have made some strong comments about that.
No, I mean, I actually think what you've said is, it actually is in keeping with the findings from our study. So I said already that when the transnational and national interacts, it actually turns out to be more of a performance than a real link-up between, I think when I got involved in the transnational EFA advocacy, in my mind what was going to happen was that I was going to keep Canadian citizens informed. And citizens in another country, India or Zimbabwe or Kenya, were going to be able to have voice with their civil society organizations, and together we're going to expand space and accountability of our two governments. This is what I had in mind. This is not at all, in practice, what emerges. Indeed, it does tend to be a performance, almost a script. Here, now we're going to do advocacy. But I wonder if, so some part of what you say I think is true, but I do wonder still whether specific types of advocacy are truer to an ethical core of linking up citizen voice. So we could perhaps look out and find forms of advocacy that hold to our normative emphasis on the voice of citizens, and other forms that are performance. I wonder, and I think in the Indian case, that was something interesting to explore. I don't know what to say about the link between, when everybody moves from providing services to doing advocacy, what gets lost in that translation? Clearly something gets lost in the translation. innovation, and as you say, I think a very important thing, voluntary action. A space for voluntary action. Something society, just being able to create self-organizing associational life in a society is really such an important aspect to the thing that civil society does. And of course, when local communities come together around a common effort and build something, this is not a bad thing, it's a wonderful thing. And if that gets lost in translation, then that's a big problem. I don't know enough about the RTE, the Right to Education Act. I just came from a conference on public-private partnerships, and there was 2 Indian NGOs represented. On the one side, strong advocates for market, right? Civil society, Center for Civil Society, arguing that the RTE has probably made a mistake in its reservation of 25% for private schools because it was the wrong mechanism for improving quality. And then the other group saying the RTE has made a mistake in this reservation because it really won't at all deal with the problem of inequality or this bifurcation of systems with private elite and public poor schools. I don't know, I think there are many different puzzles in that, and I welcome your comments, and I hope that I'll get to understand some of those puzzles in the Indian context better in the next few years. Yeah.
I have a question, you made a mention about how funding and control actually plays a significant part in what gets advocated for, what happens really.
Yeah.
I wanted to know, in your experience and looking at the comparative lens, is there an alternative mechanism which has worked anywhere where, probably, for example, money could be collected and distributed in some other way and it doesn't, or are there alternative frameworks of measurement or evaluation of NGOs because of which they're actually pursuing different goals and not necessarily, the goals that are currently being followed, which is, the funder usually asks a set of questions. If those set of questions changes over a period of time, does it actually change what gets advocated for? And therefore, do we have some evolutionary, systems or some evolution which has happened somewhere, which actually takes you, that fear of reprisal that comes? Can NGOs actually ever get away from that?
Intervention that BRAC, the Bangladeshi Rural Action Committee, has developed in education was very indigenous. So then we'd have to start thinking, well, what's the formula that allowed this organization to actually push a model for innovation in the education sector up the pathway, not to replicate from above down, but to force a new innovation up into the world community. So I wouldn't want to see it as black and white, but rather as a big problem, but not a necessarily defining problem.
The reason I'm also asking is because now, in the last 4 or 5 years, I've seen more and more NGOs complaining that all the funding in education is happening on the basis of evidence being shown on improving learning in the classroom.
Yeah.
And often people are doing other things which are very necessary.
Right.
But may not necessarily increase learning in the classroom. And it's become very difficult for NGOs to get sustainable funding because everything is linked to improving learning in the classroom. So
That's a pattern happening here in India.
Yes.
I think it is happening in most of the African
in
countries I've looked at as well. Yeah. I think it's real. What you're describing is a real challenge. Personally, I'm not as, I actually have found this move to a focus on learning not a bad thing in the African countries that I have been. Because I think without that focus on learning, a lot of things were happening without much attention to really the child. I can give you examples of many NGOs that spent their life trying to improve district education officers' processes for school inspection, but they never ever asked one question about the child. That's worrying to me. So the learning thing actually, I think, gets back to the child. That's the bright part of it. The negative part, of course, is that then well, once you unpack what they mean by learning, you'll see that it's whether the child could read, which to me is also a fundamental right of citizenship. So I'm not so objecting to that, but then what about all the other things that the child should learn to develop active voice? It's not only reading, that's critical but not only. So I think it's a narrowing, but I'm not as worried about it as maybe some of these NGOs are. No. Other questions? Yes, please.
My question related to the India. In India, interstate migration is very common. In like interstate migration, their entire family they used to migrate. Example, taking Bangalore, there are a lot of construction workers there. They used to send their school in the local Kannada school. After around 5-6 years, they go to their native other states like Tamil Nadu, Kerala. For those students, very difficult to go with their own language.
Yes.
How we are going to tackle this problem? This especially here in colonies, they are inside our campus. 50 families, there are all from Andhras. They are studying here nearby school, government school, Kannada they are studying.
Right.
After 5 or 6 years, they definitely they'll go back to their Andhra.
Yeah.
Then how they will go to their school, how
Right.
they will scope out
How
the
they
school.
would do it, yeah.
Yeah, how they, what are the NGOs working in this field? I don't think so. There is an NGO working in this field,
Yeah.
and how it's going to be tackled? Because around 20 crores people are in India.
Yeah.
They are migrating, interstate migrating, especially for the construction worker. This job is always depends upon the real estate sector. Whether it sometimes it go up, it will go down. When it's going down, they will go back to their family, their own city.
Yeah.
How we are going to tackle this problem?
So I mean, I don't think I have an answer to that question. I'd like to know what you think, how you think it could be tackled. But just a couple of reflections. So first of all, you know, I haven't seen many schools in India. Only 2, in fact, in rural setting, and then 2 schools for migrant workers. So I've seen 4 schools in all, which is not a really very big sample to draw some conclusions about. But I think that this Nali Kali experiment, which is an experiment that gives a scaffolding to the teacher but provides a kind of step-by-step learning for the child, is something very powerful that can be used in second language education. Why do I say that? Because you can have a bilingual setting with children moving through a curriculum in different languages. So it's something to really think about. How can we use these tools, which are a kind of ladder of learning in different languages at a parallel time? It could be very, very powerful. But you know, the problem of migration is a global problem. It's actually not only a problem from one state to the other, but one country to the other. And there we face, you know, maybe we for many decades, we've all said in education, mother tongue learning, always the best. But the realities of global life are not mother tongue learning. For a very large number of children, bilingual education may be the best, but non-mother tongue learning is going to be the reality. And then we have to start thinking, what is it that we can do for children who are learning in a second language from their first schooling experience? What supports do they need? How can we ensure that they progress rapidly? I mean, we actually know that children can progress very rapidly in second language learning, faster than I can or you can. They're sponges and they can grow. But they need the right scaffold, the right support to do that. So sometimes, rather than get too complicated with the problem, we just have to ask ourselves the question, what are the small interventions we might make so that that child can move into a second language environment without too much, first of all, without being excluded from the learning process, and in ways that actually give them a little bit of a rush into the second language. And it's possible. That's one area in Canada we have a lot of experience in. In a city like my home, Toronto, about 60% of the children come from non-English speaking households, and yet everyone enters grade 1 in an English classroom. How does that happen? And our immigrants to Canada, the children of immigrants perform actually better than children whose parents were born in Canada. How did that happen? It's a complicated story how that happens, but certainly this idea of mother tongue literacy is just not a reality anymore in most economically growing societies. Where economy is stagnant, people aren't moving, or not moving as much. Well, sometimes they are if there's conflict, but where the economy is growing, people start to move. And then we face very, very complicated language policies.
It was interesting that you used the term client in your presentation for students because that comes from a certain paradigm. But I thought that when you talked about definitional challenges, the term client in fact should be added to that list, because how are different civil service organizations defining the client? Are clients always students or children? That is not clear from where they're coming from.
Yes.
But then even if they are thinking of them as students, what aspect of education they think they are trying to serve
Yes.
is very different. And that perhaps leads to a lack of coordination, because they do not have a common platform except perhaps some organization form of being non-government.
Yeah, I think that's right. I just wanted to highlight the use of client in this official policy discourse because it marks a real change. The notion of a client versus the notion of a citizen, it's very different. To the client, one delivers a service. To the citizen, one delivers an entitlement, a right. So just to draw that contrast. But I think, you're backing up a stage and saying, well, what is it that the person providing an education, what are they imagining they are providing? What is the service they're providing? But you could also have to ask it using a citizenship frame. What is the entitlement that they believe they're providing? We could say education, but we know education is kind of a plastic word. It could have so many different things inside it.
This is with regard to the experience that you've had in Africa. In few of the rural areas, I don't have much experience working in rural areas, but where I've seen the voluntary organizations which are working with indigenous people, they face a lot of problems with regard to keeping up because of financial issues. They, I'll give you an example of an NGO which was working in the remote area in Rajasthan, Western Rajasthan, and they could not keep up with their main agenda, and they shifted to health and other things and doing that. So because they were getting a little bit of funding for that. So how does, I think African countries will also be facing the similar kind of financial problems. How do they cope up with this and they stick on to their main agenda of what they started with, not deviate with the funding?
So I actually think that, at least for some of the big international non-governmental organizations, it's exactly this problem that led them to focus on pushing governments to provide common entitlements. Because they realized that, development work is very fad-driven. One day it's this flavor, and the next day it's that flavor. And an NGO would be running this way and that way, trying to figure out how to, I've seen some really funny proposals where an NGO took something on this area and then they reframed it in the language that the donor wanted, and they try to push it through by all means. This is a commonplace. So I think that was actually, you can go back, there's a beautiful piece from maybe 1990 by David Archer, who was for many years the head of ActionAid's work in education. He's talking about his work in Bangladesh, or ActionAid's work in Bangladesh, and how they came as an organization to the conclusion that, providing services and chasing after money wasn't going to solve any of the problems. And that they had to find a way to, yes, they could fill the gap, but they had to find a way to make sure that the government itself, over a very long term, wasn't ignoring these populations that they were working with. So how could they do that? So I think that problem was, that's how they solved it. The other way, NGOs who are doing really important work for, remember, government is never going to be able to deal with these small populations that have distinct needs, because government works with a very standardized model, right? It's very crude, in fact, the kind of programs governments do. Very unlikely to respond to these. In that instance, it can be the case that the NGOs working for indigenous peoples can organize collectively. And we've seen this very powerfully in the expansion of indigenous education rights in Latin America. These NGOs across many different, not the same ethnic groups, but many indigenous populations have managed to develop their own organization, people's organizations, that now have a Latin America-wide coalition, and spend a good deal of time motivating their governments by helping international organizations to come up with policy frames. So it's sometimes the NGO has to scale up their thinking and push an issue higher up the national policy agenda to keep the funding flowing for what they're doing.
What I want to know is we're talking about the education and NGOs associated with it. Now, my major question is, it's one of my favorite questions. And
I hope it's a really hard one.
let's see that. I just want to know, what is the feasibility and what is the effectivity of education that we deal with, through NGOs or through the civil societies. The second part of the same thing is though, as you said, you're not very well versed with the Indian civil society, what were the actions that you took in Africa when you were dealing with situations wherein you have the basic education done for some children, and how they come at par with the society in the later stages?
Ask me the second part again. So you have basic...
See, we educate the children there, but how effective are they in coming at par with the society? So, the employment opportunities, or if you can talk about the way they gel up in the society. So that's one thing which is pretty common in India, but I want to know what was the scenario in Africa and how you guys dealt with that.
So I haven't directly tried to address that problem. Rather, I've looked at how other organizations have tried to address the problem. And there's so many different routes. I mean, you find many organizations that deliver services in education, then decide to work on transition to work, so technical vocational training. Many, many different avenues for this. But it's not a simple question, right? Because, in fact, the way a society deals out opportunities for employment sometimes has very little to do even with the kind of education a child receives. Sometimes it's just, I guess in the high-tech sector in India, you do sit an exam where they test your real knowledge. But actually, most employers don't test anybody's real knowledge. They just say, rubber stamp, gone to this school, I should hire them. So it's a very challenging problem. And I think two things about it. First of all, if you work in the education sector, you always have to think, what's the life chance of the child that I'm working with? You can't avoid it. On the other hand, you should never get discouraged by the fact that the education system itself can't change the society, the whole society around it. And you should still focus on this very fundamental dimension of learning. That is, a child who can learn to learn, can learn to solve problems, can then go into the world and help solve them. So it's not your job to make the entire life pathway of a child through education, but certainly your job to make sure that the child has capacities that allow them to shape their future. So I never think of schooling as how many items of knowledge have been banked in this child. No. I always think about it as, what's the capacity of that child to go out and shape their future, their own future? I don't know if that was a good answer, but I guess.
You briefly touched upon this alliance between the middle class and the working class and how it's worked for some of the African countries.
It hasn't worked in African countries. It has not worked at all. So the social citizenship literature is entirely about the development of social welfare states in the West. In Africa, there's almost no middle class.
Okay, so I was just thinking of this example of UASE you were speaking about. They're working directly with the grassroots level, I guess, in the sense that kind of trying to raise the consciousness at that level. So, have they been able to get the middle class of these countries into this debate, or is it just the grassroots level that
I would say if you wanted to understand the kind of alliance around education for all in most of the African countries I looked at, it would be an alliance between NGOs and an international community. There's very, very little domestic constituency for education as an issue, except in one instance. If a government is going to election, it's newly democratic, and it wants to provide an instant demonstration of the rights the goods and rights it will provide to its new citizens, it will declare universal primary education. Malawi, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, all declared universal primary education as part of new democracy. So yes, a government gets interested, and only access, right? They're not really interested in quality, but they will provide it as a demonstration to their citizens. But other than that, the coalition, I sometimes struggle to think where that alliance is going to emerge in African countries, because there really isn't a middle class, and the middle class that exists is primarily extracting wealth, not reinvesting wealth. That's changing a little bit now. In the last few years, it's changed a little bit because the economies are growing and there's more wealth to reinvest. But by and large, that alliance doesn't exist in the African civil society. So it's actually quite a puzzle. How do you get this middle class poor alliance between middle class and poor? At the moment, their interests really don't intersect at all. It's possible to live a middle class life with very little interface with the poor. And by the way, just to say, middle class is a kind of funny term. I think, to be clear, in Africa, there's hardly any middle class. You basically either are poor and you are either completely an underclass, i.e. you have no form of employment and live on less than $1 a day, or you have a little bit of employment, but you're still very poor, or you're already completely living in a cash economy, and there you're not really middle class, you're upper middle class already.
You mentioned about common schooling and the experiment not really, showing much promise in lots of us. I want to know, in the context of common schooling as a term, is it really still relevant in the times that we live in?
Yeah.
Is it a concept that was born at a certain point of time and, yes, it does have some advantages and some equitable, things with it, but do we actually need differentiated schooling? In light of the charter school movement also, do we actually need, it doesn't need to be some private agenda, but it can be a public agenda, but do we really need common schooling?
I just don't think that we will. The question is an important one. And it's very important also that we examine the question in our own behaviors, right? So, as a Canadian parent myself, I can tell you that of course I think that not every child needs the same things, and therefore it doesn't make sense to imagine that every school should look exactly the same. But then I also think, once we go down the slope of providing dramatically different kinds of education to different children, the chances are very high, at least in societies with high levels of social inequality, which we all, to some degree, live in, that it's the least privileged child who will get the least in the system. So I can't think of another way than a common school to achieve. Yeah?
Say something.
Yeah.
See, the idea of common school is not that you give the same thing to every child.
Yeah.
Idea of common school is that there is a school where every child from every section of the society can go, which becomes a cohesive space for the society.
Right.
And every child receives equal quality education.
Right.
So common school does not mean that you grind every child in similar kind of pieces. This simply means giving equal quality opportunity for learning to every child.
That's a philosophical meaning.
Yes.
But the administrative meaning.
But actually, common schooling comes from a philosophical agenda.
Yes, absolutely.
Because common schooling comes from a philosophical agenda of equality.
Yes.
And equality again a philosophical meaning.
Yes.
I don't think human beings are equal in anywhere. And we still stand for that. So therefore, in India at least, common school has been enabling in this manner.
Yes.
Now if you have that agenda,
Yes.
then perhaps Parth's question will be easier to reply, and
Yeah,
your second part, equality, becomes important.
Right.
But I also had another small comment to make about this evidence-based thing.
Yes.
The real problem in India with NGOs actually is not evidence-based. this is a complex question.
Yeah.
Supposing that in primary government, say 200 government primary schools, you want to do something with the teachers.
Okay.
And there is evidence needed at the end of 1 year
Okay.
in learning achievements. Now this is quite an impossibility.
Yes.
Because 100 government schools, the government structure, officials interacting with teachers, pedagogy, changing teachers' views, changing teachers' habits. So you have no chance if you really want to do good learning in the schools.
Yeah.
But then I come here with the government and I say that forget about all this improving education for next 50 years.
Yeah.
I will just put a teacher there and train her for 2 hours. And you measure after 6 months, children will be learning more. Now this is possible to do this thing because a new person is put there. And then after 6 months you have evidence that the longer term program has no evidence to show, and that this 6-month program. Now what will happen is, this is a very thin program which has not improved Indian education anywhere.
Right.
But in the policy, thinner programs get spread. Therefore, evidence-based thing could be tweaked in a such manner that something which will actually make lasting change in education gets throttled, and something which is not going to make changes but is going to show changes within 6 or 7 months will spread like wildfire. That is the problem in India. And because of this, all the civil society space now is being acquired by 2 kinds of actors, INGOs and CNGOs. CNGOs have India a new thing which is called corporate NGOs. And there is something.
Give me an example of a corporate NGO.
There used to be something. There used to be something RNGO, which is more or less extinct.
What's an RNGO?
Real NGO.
Real NGO. I think I have a lot to learn about the change in the NGO sector in India. Thank you.
Any last questions?
Yes, sir.
I've just been wondering that when we're talking of relation between the civil society and between the poor, or between the climate, right? How is it that a coalition between civil society organizations is seen in the larger frame of working on education, or for that matter, any issue of importance to that nation? For example, in corruption today, most kinds of organizations have got together in India, in this. But does it require that kind of a momentum?
I think so. I mean, I think that would be my argument, that it does require that kind of momentum to really make effective change.
For that matter, then education will never have that kind of momentum.
I'm not entirely sure about that. I mean, and I wouldn't despair too much about it. That, well, it's not, education is never going to be a life and death issue. It's never going to be like anti-corruption in the same way, because corruption can be picked up very directly by the middle. But I think that the civil society and education is actually quite well developed. It exists, and it is possible for those organizations to act in coalition. And we've got some very important examples of that. I think the Brazil example is probably the most powerful of any, where the civil society actors managed to come together and use the judicial system to, in Brazil, education for the poor simply did not exist. Today, education for everyone exists in Brazil in the public system. And that has happened in the 15th century, and because of the ability of these civil society actors to come together. And more than that, those civil society actors have been able to create a space for conversation at the national level. What does quality education mean in this country? What does that look like for us? That's very local and specific. So I actually won't give up on the idea of coalitions. I don't think it's at all impossible. But, you know, I sometimes am accused of being more of an optimist than a pessimist.
a way of being optimistic for the rest of us as well. This is a class I wish I had taken when I was studying, but I'm very glad that our students got a chance to hear you, and I hope they are able to work with you on research as well as taking some of these ideas and integrating them in the courses that we study going forward. So